In the next hour, we will learn about nitrate leaching and agroecosystems across the Midwest. Kelsey is going to start us off. She's an outreach specialist in the Ag Water Quality Program covering the northwest of the state. Take it away, Kelsey.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Laura, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming here today to kind of talk about nitrate leaching. So today we'll be talking about trends in the Midwest to local impacts in Wisconsin. So we will kind of start by talking about the state of groundwater quality in Wisconsin. Then we'll go over some nitrate leaching basics and agricultural systems just to make sure we're all on the same page before diving into a research study on nitrate leaching trends in the Midwest, hitting on some Wisconsin-specific issues regarding timing and climate, and then looking at some potential solutions and moving forward before handing it off to Dr. Hartfiel from Discovery Farms. So every 5 years, the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection puts out a groundwater quality report based on their groundwater quality sampling across the state of Wisconsin. So they use a random stratified sampling approach. So this way they're able to kind of capture the diversity of Wisconsin's landscapes and also track changes in groundwater quality over time. So this map we have here on the right, those gray circles are private wells where no nitrate was detected. The orange circles are where nitrate was detected from 2 milligrams per liter to 10 milligrams per liter, which is our groundwater standard here in Wisconsin. And then those red circles are where private wells exceeded the drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter, which has been associated with negative health outcomes, especially for our vulnerable populations like pregnant women and children. And this map too also has land use cover overlaid on it. So those areas that are darker in green are where more than 75% of the land has been cultivated. So from the report in 2023, 7.3% of private wells exceeded that groundwater standard. And these were more likely to be found in areas that had a greater percentage of cultivated land. Which again makes sense because we know we grow a lot of nitrogen hungry crops here in Wisconsin, but when that nitrogen is not taken up by the crop, it can get into our water that's used for drinking. And then I also wanted to share that 32.7% of private wells are between 2 milligrams per liter and 10 milligrams per liter. So 2 milligrams per liter, and sometimes people use 1 milligrams per liter, but that's evidence that there was some sort of human impact on that well water quality that's kind of above background nitrate concentrations. And the reason I wanted to share this stat is because that in-between category kind of impacts a lot of wells we have here across Wisconsin. And of course, if we're going to take a preventative approach, we want to make sure that we're not just focusing in on those areas that are already at our groundwater exceedance, or drinking water exceedance, but also putting some energy in those areas where we can prevent getting to that exceedance level. So now to go over some nitrate leaching basics in agricultural systems. So really for nitrate leaching to happen, we need kind of two things. So we need a source of that nitrogen, which is really that surplus end balance. We'll talk a bit more on the next slide. And this is largely impacted by nitrogen management. But we also need kind of a transport or something to move that nitrate through the soil profile. And this is really an impact of drainage, which is impacted by precipitation, soil texture, and evapotranspiration, or kind of how much crops or plants are taking water out of the system. So when we think a bit more about that surplus end balance, first figuring out what the end balance is of the soil. And we're just going to go over this really briefly because my colleague Long is going to be talking in depth about end balances and crop rotations in 2 weeks at the next webinar. So it's kind of just a flash course in it. But when we think about that end balance, first considering all of the nitrogen inputs into the system. So that includes the big ones like fertilizer and manure, but also things like crop residue and sometimes irrigation if the water used for irrigation has high nitrate levels. Then you also have to consider the nitrogen output of the system. So how much nitrogen is moved either through crop harvest or maybe through nitrogen gas as well. And then there's also this storage piece. So some organic matter is going to be mineralized by microbes, which mineralize it into plant available forms like ammonium that can be transformed into that nitrate form. which is that negatively charged fraction of nitrogen that doesn't stick well to our negatively charged soils and can kind of readily move with water. But on the flip side, bacteria can also kind of immobilize these plant available forms back into organic matter, depending on the carbon content of the soil. And when it's in that organic matter fraction, it's kind of safe and not going to be moving with that water. So taking these all together, we get the nitrogen balance of the soil. But what we often see in our Midwestern ecosystems is that our nitrogen supply, whether that's coming from fertilizer or maybe it's nitrogen fixed by our legumes like the hairy vetch I have on this slide, but often our nitrogen supply is outweighing our nitrogen demand, or how much nitrogen those crops and roots are really demanding and removing from the system. And this leaves us with kind of a surplus and balance. So Kasman and some colleagues looked at the average amount of fertilizer uptake in our Midwestern corn production systems. So this is the amount of fertilizer that's recovered in above ground biomass in corn production systems, and it was only about 37%. So while this can vary a lot from study to study or environment to environment, you rarely ever read it uptake efficiency kind of above 50%. So that's leaving us with a really big chunk of nitrogen that's unused, which really begs the question of where does this approximately 63% of unused nitrogen go? We know that a portion of it is going to be lost as nitrogen gas, and this can really be a function of how that nitrogen was applied, whether it was on the surface, maybe injected or banded. We know that some of it is going to be temporarily stored in soil and kind of safe in that organic matter fraction. But from our groundwater data, we know that a large chunk of it is also going to get leached to our groundwater in that nitrate form. So what does this nitrate look like across the Midwestern landscape? And this is really the question that Dr. Stresa, Dr. Masaryk, and Dr. Kucharik tried to answer with this meta-analysis. So they looked at 325 studies across 12 Midwestern states. And so this was over kind of 1,400 observations. And the reason they did this is they really wanted to get a more complete picture of nitrate leaching across the Midwest. So when you're looking at individual studies, they're often asking questions specifically maybe about soil type or cropping type, but not really how all of these different things are interacting on the agricultural landscape. So with this study, they were kind of able to investigate those interactions. So the first thing they looked at was vegetation type and nitrate leaching. So on the vertical axis, we have nitrate leaching in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare annually. And I've also converted the approximations to pounds per acre on the table on the right, if you're just more used to looking at those units. And then on the horizontal axis, we have vegetation type that they looked at. And the unshaded bars are the unfertilized observations, and the shaded bars are the fertilized observations. And above each bar, you'll see a number in parentheses that refers to how many observations they had for that cropping type. So if we look at the potato first, on average, this had the most nitrate leached of all the other different crops they looked at, so approximately 53 pounds per acre. And if we think about our potato systems, they tend to have higher nitrogen additions than a lot of our other crops that are grown in the Midwest. So on average, they had about 213 pounds per acre. We also know specifically in Wisconsin that a lot of potato production is concentrated in really sandy soils that have those high drainage conditions that can kind of readily move that nitrate. And then if we look on the other, kind of the opposite side of the graph, we have our bioenergy crops, which included miscanthus and switchgrass. We also have some other grasses and poplar, and these had much lower amounts of nitrate leach. So on average, about 10 pounds per acre. And so there's a couple of things going on here. These crops tended to have more modest nitrogen inputs, so around 72 pounds per acre. But a lot of these crops are also perennials with really deep root systems that are in the ground year round, demanding that nitrate. And especially with bioenergy crops too, a lot of biomass is removed off of the field. So we have a lot of nitrogen being removed and not leading to that surplus in the soil. If we keep moving down the line, next we have our corn. We know corn, of course, is another nitrogen hungry crop. But from that 37% fertilizer uptake efficiency stat we were looking at earlier, we know that corn isn't always the best at taking up all the fertilizer that we give it. So on average, corn leached about 31 pounds per acre annually. If we keep moving down the line, the next one we have is our alfalfa clover systems. And these ones actually kind of surprisingly leached more than the corn systems at about 40 pounds per acre. And the first thing I will say, you can see those number of observations above the alfalfa and clover, and we only have about 12 observations, 12 or 13. So definitely something we need a bit more research on. But this kind of goes against what we often think of for alfalfa and clover systems, because these are perennial systems that have really deep roots that are really good at taking up nitrogen. So I was diving into the primary literature a little bit more, looking at some studies they did in Michigan, and they compared alfalfa that had manure on it versus alfalfa that didn't have manure on it. And what they found is that there was really similar yields between these two treatments, which suggests that the alfalfa was able to get plenty of nitrogen from the soil and really wasn't able to make use of that manure, leaving the alfalfa in those surplus end conditions where that nitrate can move once we get some precipitation or water moving through the soil profile. So it's just kind of interesting to think about that. It's not just that a crop is perennial or in the ground year round, but we have to make sure that there's not also that surplus nitrate moving through the soil profile. And next, going through the line, we have soybeans, which leached a little bit less at 25 pounds per acre. And the reason we likely see this for soybeans is we know that in most of our systems, soybeans are not receiving nitrogen fertilizer, so there's just a little bit less nitrogen moving through the system with this vegetation type. So the next thing they looked at was crop rotation and nitrate leaching, because of course we know that most farmers aren't just growing one crop here in the Midwest. And this graph is set up really similar to that last graph. And what they found is that there was some evidence of reduced leaching in corn soybean rotations compared to continuous corn, so about 10.2 pounds per acre. So this wasn't statistically significant, but it did suggest evidence that when we introduce a crop into a rotation that potentially has less nitrogen fertilizer needs, we can see a positive impact on that reduction of nitrate leaching. And I think this is a really good teaser for Gulong's talk in 2 weeks about what would nitrate leaching look like with other rotations. As we start to add in more crops that maybe have reduced nitrogen needs or perhaps take more nitrogen out of the system, what would that look like in terms of nitrate leaching? So I'll let him talk about that more in 2 weeks, but just wanted to put the question out. The next thing that they looked at was timing and nitrate leaching. And this comes from actually just data from Wisconsin. And this is based on a study that Dr. Massard did at the Arlington Research Station for 6 years, measuring nitrate leaching in a variety of different cropping systems. And what he found is that 73 to 75% of all nitrate leaching happened between April 1st and June 30th. And when he included other months of the non-growing season, so from January to February, this accounted for 88% of the total of nitrate leached for the entire study. So what his research really showed was that the majority of nitrate leaching happens in between the growing seasons rather than in the growing seasons. And if we think about what our fields look like during this time, it kind of makes sense, especially if we're thinking maybe about spring. We can have those surplus N balance conditions. So we might have some unused N from the cropping season if it made it through the winter. Perhaps there is some spring N applications happening at this time when the demand for N is low, especially if it's not a perennial system or we don't have cover crops. There's really nothing demanding that N. The soils also might be warming up at this time, so they can be transforming that organic matter into nitrate that could readily move with water. And when we pair this with our, challenging drainage conditions at this time, where evapotranspiration is low because plants are not removing water from the system, we might have snow melts or rainfall, and this could be happening on saturated soil conditions. So ultimately, just a lot of water moving through the soil profile. And when we think about spring specifically, when we have that high drainage, this is something historically we've seen in Wisconsin. So this data comes from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. And what it shows is that during our springtime here in Wisconsin, across much of the state, we've seen a 10 to kind of 20% increase of spring precipitation. And this is often concentrated in areas where we have a lot of agriculture in our state. And when we have an increase in spring precipitation, this can exacerbate our drainage conditions and ultimately exacerbate our nitrate leaching losses if we have that surplus N and it's not protected. And this is only expected to kind of increase. So this is using that's looking at historical data, and then this is looking at climate data forward. So using models to predict what it might look like from 2040 to 2060. And what you can see, there's a predicted 10% increase of precipitation kind of across the state of Wisconsin. So the last variable that they looked at in the study was corn yield and nitrate leaching. So that solid line in the graph is a yield curve. So many of you might be familiar with these from all of the great ones that Monica Schauer has been creating with the nitrogen optimization pilot program. And that dashed line is the nitrate leaching curve. So what you'll see from the yield curve is that ultimately yield plateaus because at some point the crop can no longer make use of that applied fertilizer. So there's kind of no yield benefit as they keep adding more fertilizer, leaving us in those surplus N conditions because we have too much supply of N that really the crops are not demanding. And we see the opposite relationship with our nitrate leaching curve. So that's kind of increases exponentially. And that really leaves us with a question of how do we start to move down this leaching curve? So the first one is really reducing that surplus N balance. And the first way to do that is building an N balance in the first place. You ultimately have to know how much nitrogen is going into the system and how it's behaving in terms of yield or how much nitrogen is being removed in order to manage it. The next one is balancing that N supply to reduce surplus N. So one way to do that is nitrogen rate studies to reduce unused N. So for example, the nitrogen optimization pilot program that's been kind of happening across the state. I was just reading some recent research that they put out comparing a treatment where they had poultry manure and commercial fertilizer. And they were able to reduce, I think it was like 20 or 30 pounds of commercial fertilizer on those poultry manure treatments because they realized that that poultry manure is providing a lot of nitrogen and yield benefits. So it might not seem like a lot on 1 acre, but as I've heard Monica say before, you know, if you're able to reduce 20 or 30 pounds on 1 acre, if we scale that up to hundreds or thousands of acres, we might really be able to have an impact on this amount of, or reducing that unused N. And the other one I wanted to put on here was managing low yielding acres of a field. And this really comes from when I was talking to a farmer about 6 months ago or the last growing season. And he was telling me that when he was a kid, his dad always used to tell him to, if they had extra fertilizer or manure, to add that onto the low yielding acres of the fields because they could really use that boost. And what he was telling me is that as he's gotten older and manages the farm himself, his relationship with nitrogen management has really changed. Because what he realized is that some areas of the field are always going to be low yielding, whether that's due to maybe drainage or compaction or maybe some pest issues. So they're really not able to make use of that extra N. And it would be better off putting it somewhere else on the field where we really can see the crops benefit and make use of that N. So while he wasn't necessarily talking in terms of N surplus or maybe nitrate leaching hotspots, ultimately he was talking about this landscape management and paying attention to areas that are lower yielding where it might not actually be a nitrogen issue and potentially fixing something else like compaction or drainage or pest management can really have an impact. The next one I'll talk about is once we have that N surplus, which we know is inevitable with our cropping systems that are a little leaky, it's important to protect it. And one way to protect that, the N surplus, is with cover crops. So not just a blanket statement of cover crops, but what does that actually mean? And we want to make sure to prioritize overwintering cover crops because these are going to provide the greatest protection during that springtime. We want to make sure that there is roots and crops in the ground in spring when we have, 75% of all leaching that happens in our state potentially. We want to make sure that we have something demanding that N versus if we have winter killed cover crops, we're not going to have something there to protect during that very vulnerable time. And then also thinking about cover crop biomass. So I have this study that was adapted from my former colleague, Kelsey based on a study that was done in Maryland. And those blue bars are looking at cover crop biomass, and the horizontal axis is looking at planting date starting at the 29th of August. And then the orange curve is looking at cumulative nitrate leach. And what you can see is kind of intuitively that the earlier the cover crop was planted, the more cover crop biomass it was able to produce. But you can also see is that the more cover crop biomass there was, this also really reduced the cumulative amount of nitrate leached. So of course, I know that the study was in Maryland, so maybe 29th of August is not a realistic cover crop planting date for our systems here in Wisconsin, especially in continuous corn or corn soybean. But I think it does open the door for us to start to think about what rotations really exist to achieve these cover crop goals. Is it possible to introduce something into the system, maybe that's harvested earlier, so we can prioritize getting those cover crops in and demanding that biomass that's really going to protect us against that nitrate being leached. And the last one I'll end on is conducting local nitrate leaching research to fine-tune recommendations for Wisconsin. So with local research, we're really able to test the efficacy of conservation practices used to reduce nitrate leaching and really make sure to fine-tune these for our Wisconsin context. So this type of research helps us answer questions like, how much cover crop biomass do we need to have to really have a meaningful impact on nitrate leaching? And really what's possible under the different soil types, rotations, and climate conditions we have in this state. And of course, we're the dairy state, so how do things like manure impact the surplus and balance in nitrate? Which is why I'm super excited to have Dr. Lindsey Hartfiel from Discovery Farms here with me today to really talk about some of this local research that's happening in Wisconsin dairy systems. So thank you for having me. This is my contact information, and I will hand it off to Laura.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. Thanks so much. Great presentation. As we transition to our next speaker, Lindsey, we are going to launch a quick poll to collect some information for you guys. This anonymous information helps us evaluate the audiences that we're reaching, and we appreciate you to fill it out. At the end, we also have another little poll that will be a question more specific to this topic. And again, that just allows us to see how we're doing, how we can better our information for the future. I've seen a couple questions come in the Q&A tab. That's great to see. Please feel free to continue to ask questions. And after Dr. Hartfield presents, I'll dive into those both for Kelsey and Lindsey. Okay. All right, sounds great. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Lindsey Hartfiel. Lindsey is the program manager for Discovery Farms, an on-farm research program within UW-Madison Extension. I'll hand it off to you, Lindsey.
Thanks, Laura. Just quick, making sure I have the right presentation mode is showing.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, thanks, Kelsey, for setting me up today. I will be transitioning things to talk about the local impacts, focusing on our nitrogen leaching studies here in Wisconsin through Discovery Farms monitoring efforts. I know we've heard about Discovery Farms monitoring in our last couple webinars, but for those who maybe aren't super familiar with what Discovery Farms is, I did want to provide just a quick little overview for those who aren't familiar. Discovery Farms is a farmer-led research and outreach program within the Division of Extension here in Wisconsin that conducts studies on private working farms across the state to better understanding of the relationships between different agricultural practices and water quality. And the Discovery Farms program started in the early 2000s. And when Discovery Farms started, the focus was more on surface runoff and tile drainage. But more recently, we've transitioned into adding in some infield nitrate leaching monitoring as well. So to do this infield nitrate leaching, our goal first and foremost is to better our understanding of the leaching of nitrate below the crop root zone, especially in areas of the state that are being impacted with high levels of nitrate in their groundwater. To do this monitoring, we use what is called equilibrium tension lysimeters, and I know that is a mouthful. So I'm going to refer to them as lysimeters going forward, but I'm going to break this down into hopefully a little bit more digestible information for us all to understand. So at the core of what these lysimeters are, if you look to the right of the screen, you see the diagram outlined in the yellow box is what we refer to as the lysimeters. In the case of our monitoring, these are essentially just metal boxes that are buried below the crop rooting zone. With these metal boxes, they have a porous stainless steel plate on top that allows the water to infiltrate into the box, and then we can collect the amount of drainage that has passed through that crop rooting zone headed towards groundwater. Second component of our monitoring system is that these lysimeters also have a sample line connected to them. And so we are able to pump the water from the lysimeters out to collect first how much drainage there is from the lysimeters, but then also to collect a water quality sample to send to the lab for analysis. And then our third component here is that there's a vacuum line also attached to the lysimeters. This vacuum line is used to apply a small amount of suction to the lysimeters, really to mimic what is naturally happening within the soil profile. So the soil itself naturally has a little bit of suction, holds onto that, pulls that water to it. So if we didn't apply the small amount of suction to our lysimeters, the water would simply just go around that box and not actually infiltrate. So we apply this small amount of suction, really trying to mimic what's naturally happening in the soil so we can capture the natural water flow through the soil profile. So I know this diagram, it's still, I think, a little hard to understand what the equipment looks like, what it's all doing. So I've included some pictures here on this next slide of the installation of our first project that we installed with this monitoring equipment. So this is in Pepin County, Wisconsin. And here I'm highlighting that the first step in the installation really is investigating the soil profile itself. We want to be below the crop root zone. We also want to be below that first layer of the soil profile. So here you can see on this image, the top section of the soil that has a really high, darker, higher organic matter soil. And then you can see it transition to that more orange type colored soil. On this next slide here, I'm showcasing a drone image of the installation, and I'll use this laser pointer to point out. So here you're seeing a trench line, and this is where we are connecting that water sample line and the vacuum lines to. Then there's this larger hole where the lysimeter is actually placed, and I'll get a closer up image of that, but the lysimeter is within that hole. And then the last thing I'll point out here is that over here is a tarp where we have the first layer of the soil profile, and then over here is that lighter colored further down in the soil profile. So we keep the soil profile separated out when we're installing the lysimeters so that we can get them placed back as close to what was already in the soil before we put the lysimeters in. Then here is showing in that pit where the lysimeter has been placed, giving you a little closer look at it. So here you can see our sample line connected to the lysimeter, and then the vacuum line also connected to the lysimeter. Then these two images are just showing getting those water sample lines and vacuum lines connected to the lysimeter, getting them placed in the trenches. We have these sample lines running about 40 feet out into the field. So we're trying to get out into the field to capture what's happening, try to get out of those end rows of the field, get into what's more routine for the field management. And then lastly here, I'm just showing our what we refer to as our control boxes, these white boxes here. And on the right side here, this is showing what's happening inside the box. I like to refer to these control boxes as the brains of the operation. All the wires, everything going on here, that runs a program that applies that small amount of suction to the lysimeters. It checks the lysimeters periodically to see if they're maintaining that suction, if it needs to apply a little bit more suction to the lysimeters. So this really is the brains that keeps the lysimeter project running. And then lastly, I'll point out there's a PVC pipe here, and then over here by this other control box, and that is where the sample line comes up, and we were able to pump out those lysimeters and get the drainage volume and our water quality samples. So with our lysimeters, we are installing 8 per site, and we are just installing them on what we call or refer to as a control and treatment study design. So we put 4 lysimeters together on one side of the field and 4 lysimeters together on another side of the field. In the early stages of our monitoring, we keep the management the same across the entire field. and this is what we call our control management. So this is our business as usual, manage the field how we normally would. And then after a few years of data, we can get a relationship, understand how the lysimeters are working, how nitrogen leaching dynamics are happening. Then we can add a treatment in and see how that hopefully reduces nitrogen leaching within the field. So last slide before I get into some data here, I just want to highlight how the site has been managed. This is a site installed in Pepin County, looking at a dairy farm here in Pepin County. They've managed this field in a corn soybean rotation. So in our first year of monitoring, it was soybeans. Second year of monitoring was corn silage, and our third year is soybeans. Other management at this site has included a cover crop in 2023 following the corn silage year. They broadcast a cereal rye cover crop on following corn silage harvest. Other things of note, they had one pass of tillage in 2023. The farm overall uses a reduced tillage method using strip or vertical tillage and are able to maintain a high level of residue at the time of planting. And then lastly, just showcasing that there have been several nutrient applications made during our monitoring time period here. Okay, so now I'm going to start by showing some precipitation data for this site. And first thing I'm going to draw your attention to is that the scale runs from April to March. And the reason is we define a year of data for our nitrogen leaching as April 1st to March 31st. We do this to align with the crop itself. So any leaching that we're seeing in October following harvest all the way to the planting of the next crop, that's going to be related to the previous crop. So that's why we have set this timeline as April 1st to March 31st to best align as we can with the cropping system. So in our first 2 years of data, we saw a general trend of below average precipitation. This site also has irrigation, so that is included in those bars that you're seeing on the right side of the screen. But there have been a few wet time periods within that monitoring. So the first I'll draw your attention to is the spring following installation. So April and May of 22, those were both above average. And then other than that, during the growing season, there was once August was a little bit above average, but the crop was fully developed at that point using a lot of that water. So our next real above average time period was October of 2023. You'll also notice that that's a different color blue, reason being that our rain gauge at the site had some plant matter get into it during the corn silage harvest in 2023. So it wasn't accurately recording rainfall, so we replaced that data, filled it in with the nearby weather station in Durand, Wisconsin. Then we are still currently in our 2024 monitoring year, but so far the trend has been a bit different than our previous years. It was especially wet summer, wet spring, but definitely very wet summer at this particular site, well above average through June, July, and August. Then September and October, it was a bit drier. So knowing kind of how the weather pattern has been at this site, I'm going to switch gears and look at our drainage at the site. So for our lysimeters, we are working with our project partners, which is Pepin County Land Conservation and Planning Department. They are sampling our lysimeters bi-weekly. Typically, it's a bi-weekly time frame that they are checking them. And if there's drainage, you'll see these bars show up on the graph. So this thicker blue bar is the average drainage that we saw. And then there's a skinnier blue line, and that represents kind of the range of what we saw across those lysimeters. I do want to acknowledge that this was a new monitoring area for Discovery Farms. So especially in this first year, we had some challenges, some troubleshooting to do to get the equipment all running and working efficiently, working consistently. So in the first year, we had a portion of our lysimeters that worked well. So I'm showing the data from those, and they were all located on the east side of the field. So I'm just going to show the data from that side of the field for this year and just for the other years for the sake of time today, since those were the ones that have been working well throughout this whole time period. So what we saw in our first year with our drainage was that it was greatest in the spring and then tapered off after the crop was established. And that really aligns with what Kelsey was sharing with us just a few moments ago. So we see higher bars in April, May, and June. Then they definitely tapered off, but then they did pick up again after harvest was done and there wasn't a crop actively using that water. And for the whole year, we saw about a foot of drainage. Then in our second year of monitoring, we again saw our greatest drainage in the spring and early crop establishment time period, and then again, some more drainage post-harvest. It was a drier year, so total we saw just under 5 inches of drainage. And then so far this year, the pattern is a bit different. This is largely due to it being so wet in June, July, and August this year. So we actually saw the most drainage during the growing season and very little drainage post-harvest. And so far this year, again, still collecting this data, we have seen about 8 inches of drainage. So now switching gears, I'll focus in on our nitrate leaching results. So in the first year of monitoring, field was in soybeans, and we saw our highest leaching before planting and then post-harvest. I do want to draw your attention to these first couple points and make a note that the magnitude of these initial events is definitely heavily influenced by the installation. There was obviously a lot of soil disturbance to put the lysimeters in at these sites. And in doing so, that can really stimulate a lot of mineralization of that organic nitrogen, convert it into that nitrate form. And we definitely see that in these initial points. So I want to put caution when we're looking at this first year of data that the magnitude across the whole year is going to be heavily influenced by the installation. But this first year of data does still provide us some valuable context on the timing of drainage, timing of leaching. And as we get into those next years of data, then we can get a little bit more accurate on the magnitude of results. So as we look at the second year of data, we saw that there was consistently low nitrate leaching throughout the growing season. They had 4 nitrogen applications throughout this growing season. So these are these green dashed lines on the graph. So the first one is a manure application. The second one is starter that was applied with the corn silage. Then the next one is a side dress application. And then the last one was a fertigation application, as again, they are using irrigation at this site as needed. So what I want to know is that there wasn't a large jump from any of these nitrogen applications. They were trying to feed the crop small amounts of nitrogen as it needed it. And we didn't see a large increase. So this does indicate also that they were managing their irrigation well. But what we do see is post-harvest, there is one point that jumps out here. I want to note that there was a longer time period between the sample collection on this one. So that does influence how high up this point is on the graph in comparison to some of these others. Again, normally biweekly sampling here. We did have some staffing turnover during this time period with our project partner. And so there was a longer gap in this data. So the magnitude is accurate, just that it probably would have been a few smaller points on the graph if it had continued to be biweekly samples. So just a note, but this higher point post-harvest does indicate that, as Kelsey was sharing, there was a little bit of nitrogen surplus within the system. And this followed that really wet October 2023. So that extra nitrogen with the high precipitation and a crop not actively using it, we did see that extra nitrogen flush out of the system. And then this current year has been in soybeans. They planted green into a rye cover crop, and we have seen consistently low nitrate leaching throughout the whole year. No real jumps, no events that really stand out here. Just consistently pretty low nitrogen leaching. So lastly, I'm going to put this on a cumulative nitrate leaching time scale here for us. And so this is just adding those events up throughout the year. And this can be a useful way to really see if there's been a large jump from one single event or drainage event. So looking at our first year of data, again, those early points heavily influenced by the installation, the amount of soil disturbance that was done to get these lysimeters in place. So I'm not putting a ton of stock in the magnitude of the leaching in this first year of data. You can see just from those first few events, they're already up to like say about 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen leaching. If we toss out those events the rest of the year, again, don't put a whole lot of stock in the actual magnitude, but it does indicate timing of leaching when we see leaching happening. And as the system started to get equaled out, we did see a little bit of a jump post-harvest. So that's also helpful context for us. It was a good year for us to get the equipment figured out and just start to understand the nitrogen leaching dynamics. We probably don't put a whole bunch of stock in the first year in terms of the magnitude of nitrate leaching. Then in our second year of data, we saw low leaching during the growing season with several nitrogen applications, but we did see that larger event in November that does indicate some extra nitrogen within the system. There was above average precipitation in October, definitely helped flush that out. So we saw the jump from when the crop was in the field to post-harvest. Total amount of nitrogen leaching that year was right around 50 pounds per acre. If we think back to the study that Kelsey started showing us today, the average that they saw for corn was around 31 pounds per acre. So we're a little higher than that, but definitely within the range of what was seen in the study that Kelsey shared with us. Then this current year, again, we're still monitoring this. This year been low leaching, very gradual increase, especially from July through October. It's been pretty kind of plateaued out now for a little bit. Again, still monitoring, but we're not expecting a whole lot more drainage. We often don't see much drainage in the winter months because of those cold frozen soils, not a lot of water moving through it. So this year so far, we've seen 21.5 pounds per acre, so lower than previous years, despite it being a very, very wet summer at the site. And in comparison to that metadata that Kelsey shared with us earlier, this is the average for a soybean crop from that metadata was around 25 pounds per acre. So we're right around there and not expecting a whole lot more for drainage. So we will see where we shake out on this last year of data, but it's looking to be the lowest amount of nitrogen leaching we've seen at the site. Lastly, just want to highlight that this was our first site for nitrogen leaching studies. We've since added a monitoring site in Calumet County and one in Rock County. So these we'll be able to add into to build our understanding of nitrogen leaching, magnitude, timing, all those dynamics. And they're also set up with a control and treatment study design. So we will be able to evaluate several different practices to see what works to reduce nitrogen leaching by having this collection of lysimeters across the state now. So summarizing things quickly here for us to wrap it up, in our first year of monitoring, again, the results really influenced by the soil disturbance, helped us understand timing of things, but not putting a whole lot of stock behind the actual magnitude of nitrogen leaching that first year as we let the soil kind of get back to normal. In the second year, it was an overall drier year with a wet October, and we did see one large leaching event following crop harvest. About 40 pounds per acre was leached, and that indicated that there was a nitrogen surplus within the soil. And they did have multiple fertilizer applications during the year. We didn't see the large leaching events following those. They were managing their irrigation well to not be over irrigating, flushing that nitrogen out. It wasn't until we had above average precipitation in October without a crop actively using it that we saw that flush of nitrogen out. And then this last year, again, seeing low losses so far. We're still wrapping up this year of data though. So lastly, just gonna wrap things up for us and tie this back to Kelsey's presentation. So next steps for Discovery Farms will be to introduce a treatment to evaluate its effectiveness at reducing nitrate leaching. So with this site, we want to get one more year of baseline monitoring, keeping everything the same. And then we're going to be adding in this treatment. And it sounds like that's likely going to be some kind of manure management in terms of timing and placement. Then our strategies to reduce nitrate leaching. So these are tying back to Kelsey, what she shared with us. So first and foremost, we want to be reducing that nitrogen surplus, balancing our nitrogen supply and demand. Strategies she shared with us were doing those nitrogen rate studies, managing our low yielding areas of the field. But other things we can be doing is splitting those nitrogen applications, trying to feed the crop the nitrogen as it needs it, make sure we're properly crediting our manure and legume credits. And then also if we can diversify the crop rotation, add in some of those perennials that can use up that nitrogen during the time period where otherwise our fields are not being actively using up that nitrogen. And then lastly, again, the other umbrella here is protecting the nitrogen surplus balance. So if we do have it in our soil, can we get an overwintering cover crop to use that excess nitrogen during that shoulder season? Lastly, just want to thank the groups here on this slide. Without them, this research definitely would not be possible. So I want to thank them for the roles they play, especially our participating farmer. Without him being willing to have us monitor on his farm, this definitely would not be possible. With that, I can open us up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsey. Yep, we've had some questions come in, but again, feel free to put them in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. A quick question for you, Lindsey. Do you know the soil type at the Pepin County site?
It is a pretty sandy soil. So this one, as you saw in the pictures, we had to dig a pit, place the lysimeter, and then cover the lysimeter back up with the soil. These other two sites that we have in Calumet and Rock County, they are heavier soils. So we were actually able to install the lysimeter into the side of the soil profile rather than digging the whole pit and then covering the lysimeter back up, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yep, because we did have another question on how to avoid disturbing the natural soil structure and soil horizons. I don't know, is there a way, is there one kind of better than the other? It just depends on soil type.
Yeah, it does depend on the soil type. So in Pepin County, it was such a sandy soil, there wasn't the soil structure to hold the soil in place. So that was the only real way we could put the lysimeters in, was to really do all that soil disturbance. But like I said, in Calumet and Rock County, it was a bit heavier of a soil. It had enough soil structure that we were able to make a pit for us to stand in and install those lysimeters, but the lysimeter itself, we were able to go right into the side of the soil profile, make a hole big enough for the lysimeter, and get that lysimeter placed in there.
Great, thank you. Another question we had for Kelsey, and I think you answered it, but I think it is important if everyone wants to, for other people might have the same question. So there's a question on the units of N on alfalfa. So they questioned 107 units of N on alfalfa. That's a large number typically. Was it manure added or what was the story there?
Yeah, so it was manure added to these. And so I will say again, that's definitely something we need kind of more research on to look at like different varying rates. But specifically for this study, it was manure. We know that's a pretty common practice kind of around Wisconsin, is to be using manure on alfalfa. So definitely an interesting question and something to explore more with varying rates.
Okay. Thank you. Another one for you, Kelsey. So the study done on N leaching throughout the year, this person says our springs seem to happen earlier and earlier. Can you touch upon, with our changing climate, seasons changing, would that then change when we're seeing N being leached?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So the study that I presented from Kevin Sarek was from 1996 to 2002. And I do think with our changing weather patterns, it will be really interesting to have that Discovery Farms research, which is kind of more current, and especially as they build a database over time. I think even with their surface monitoring, they might be able to do some analysis to see if things have kind of changed over time. So that's a really interesting question. And yes, the data that I shared from Kevin is a little bit older, so perhaps drainage conditions could shift a bit.
Yep, great. Okay, the next question was about nitrate leaching and seeing if cover crops do make a difference. Is it being done with cover crops in different systems, like following small grains or corn silage, or is it with interseeding being done? Are there studies that are comparing different management practices with cover crops?
Yeah, so the specific study from Maryland, I just looked it up quick, and it was in cover crops after wheat. So that's a really good question about the interseeded companion crops. I'm not sure if there's studies on those, but I will definitely look into that and see if there's any more information. But yeah, this specifically was looking at triticale, radish, and I think maybe it was crimson clover after wheat in Maryland.
Great, thanks. Okay, I think so this question would be for Lindsey. Are you able to determine if there's a difference in end leaching in the natural soil profile versus, where you put the lysimeter in that's can be disturbed, backfilled and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, to say for sure the actual amount of leaching from that undisturbed soil in that first year is really hard. But we're like can see clearly there was definitely some leaching because of the disturbance, is comparing that first year of data to the year we're currently doing. Same crop, soybeans, planted around the same time, harvested around the same time. But the magnitude of the leaching is just worlds difference, around 100 pounds versus around 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So it's comparing those 2 years of data has really made it clear that that first year of data, not probably the most representative. The other thing I'll say is there was more drainage in the first year. It was a drier year. We think there was some settling over the top of the lysimeter, so it was collecting a little bit of water as well. So I think between the settling, collecting water, the soil disturbance, allowing for more mineralization to happen, and comparing to this last year of data has made it clear to us that that first year we probably will not include in terms of like the magnitude of losses going forward.
Gotcha. Great, thank you.